Welcome back to this channel, and in this video I'm going to be talking to myself about camera settings that you might need to know if you're planning to shoot indoors. Do bear in mind that this is a guideline, or at least this is what I do. So do not copy exactly what I do, because this is exactly what I said, a guideline. Instead, what you really should be doing is get what you can from this video and just adjust it so it suits you better. Anyway, let's just jump into it. Top thing you should be thinking about is the resolution. Depending on what you're planning to do with your video, you might want to think about what resolution you're planning to shoot your videos in. Now, if you're planning to share this video on YouTube, Instagram, or Facebook, then it might not be worth shooting anything more than 1080p. Yes, I know your phone probably shoots 4K videos already, and some phones out there can even shoot 8K. But do you really need to be shooting in 4K or 8K? Probably not. And the reason for that is if you're shooting in 4K, you actually need to start considering about other things like bigger memory cards, more storage space, or even a beefier computer to edit these videos. So to save yourself some money, time, and some headaches, just shoot in 1080p. Next up is frame rate. Now, if you're shooting at home or at an indoor studio, you don't really need to shoot anything that is in slow motion. So therefore, you only need to be shooting in 24 frames or 25 frames per second if you're in Australia, or 30 frames per second if you're in America. Putting it simply, frame rate is pretty much how many photos your camera is taking every second. And when you put all these frames together, you get motion, you get a video. And the higher the frame rate, the more memory it's going to take, basically because you're taking more photos every second. So if you don't need slow motion, keep the frame rate as low as possible, so either 24 or 25 frames per second or 30 frames per second. Just pick one. Next up is pretty important, and this is shutter speed. As a general rule of thumb, your shutter speed should be doubling your frame rate. So for example, if you're shooting at 24 or 25 frames per second, generally your shutter speed should be 1/50th of a second. Or if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/60th of a second. Now, if your shutter speed is too low, you're going to get a lot of motion blur. However, if your shutter speed is too high, you're going to start getting some really weird artifacts. So just remember that your shutter speed needs to be doubling your frame rate, no more, no less. And next up, this is very important, especially if you're shooting indoors, and this is ISO or ISO. Generally speaking, you want to have your ISO as low as possible. So if you can, keep it 100. But if you're shooting indoors, this is virtually impossible unless you have an army of lights. If you're unsure of what ISO is, basically ISO is when your camera increases the sensitivity of a sensor so you can collect more light, even though when it's really dark. But the problem is, once you start cranking up the ISO or increasing the sensitivity of your sensor, you're going to start getting a lot of noise or grains in your pictures. So generally, if you're shooting with an APS-C sensor or a crop sensor, I probably wouldn't push the ISO any further than 800. But of course, this is depending on what camera you're using. Now, if you're using a full frame camera, I will probably push it to about 1600 ISO, but this will also depend on what kind of camera you're using. If you're using the Sony a7S III, then you can probably push the ISO to about 6400. But for the rest of us with normal cameras, if you're using APS-C, no more than 800. If you're using a full frame, probably no more than 1600. Sometimes if I'm desperate, I actually push up to about 3200. Now, the final point of this video is actually really important, and this is white balance. For some reason, white balancing is a very common mistake, especially for beginners. And as a result, they probably get a picture that is a little bit too warm or too cool. And what I mean by that is when a picture is too warm, it means that this picture has a tinge of orange to it. And if a picture is too cool, it means that there is a bluish tint to it. And to measure the temperature of a color, it is often referred to as Kelvin. High Kelvin means that it's going to be a warm picture, low Kelvin means it's going to be a cooler picture. Now, depending on the light bulb that you're using in your house, when you're shooting, your temperature or your Kelvin needs to be different. It might be a cooler light bulb or it could be a warmer light bulb. You just need to adjust your camera to it. As a rule of thumb, you probably need to set your temperature or your white balance at about 4500 Kelvin, and then just move up and down depending on how warm or how cool your light bulbs are in the room. Also, another tip to measure your Kelvin is to make sure you have a white piece of paper in the room, and when you're pointing your camera at it, make sure that piece of paper is actually white. Not orange or blue, white. So there you go, that's 5 tips on how to shoot indoor videos. So before I go, here's a quick recap. If you're only shooting for social media, just shoot in 1080p. So the resolution should be 1920 by 1080. If you're not planning to do any slow-mo videos, just keep your frame rate to 24-25 frames per second, or just keep it at 30 frames per second. Just pick one. Your shutter speed needs to be doubling your frame rate, no more, no less. Keep your ISO as low as possible, no matter what light you have. So if you're using an APS-C or crop sensor, no more than 800 ISO. If you're using a full frame camera, no more than 1600 ISO. Set your white balance to 4500 Kelvin and then just shift it up or down depending on the temperature of the light bulbs. Hope you learned something new from this video and that it was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.